A funny little story I remember a while back from the late 80s and early 90s that I noticed recently documented on the Laughing Policeman website, which is a very good website on this and other ham-related japery. I'll link to that in the description below. For those of my viewers who are new or who subscribed for the EV content, you will likely know I am also a radio ham. Without going into the detailed history of radio repeaters in the UK, here's a very quick oversight. To help enable long-distance mobile radio communications between ham radio operators in moving vehicles, radio repeaters were and are still set up and configured to enable the radio signals from one location to be repeated to another location, via usually an elevated antenna repeating station that is able to pick up the incoming signal and boost it over a much wider range. There are many of these repeater stations positioned in strategic locations, most often installed and maintained by radio hams with funding for the sites and equipment either via donation, subscription or more latterly now by the repeater keepers themselves. Sadly, these days with the advent of modern comms, repeaters are used rarely. However, back in the days before this huge jump in technology, they were very busy and very useful modes of longer range VHF and UHF communication. However, as with any publicly open amenity, they are open to abuse and misuse. Over the years, there have been many attempts to jam and misuse repeaters, leaving them virtually useless for use by any third party. As a young fledgling radio ham back in the early 1990s, I noticed this quite quickly. Living within the shadow of GB3VA in my hometown of Banbury, North Oxfordshire, that from time to time people and or things would disrupt the repeater. This ranged from people talking over the input in silly voices, people just keying up and not saying anything, to music being played, and it went on. The very best policy as it was then as it is now was just to ignore this kind of behaviour and never engage with the protagonists. However, this was very hard to do when the individuals involved, and I have to say who were often other radio amateurs, made automatic transmitting equipment that would sit remotely in fields and on hilltops, often hidden inside Coke cans and plastic boxes. There were very often simple transmitters and circuits designed to transmit on the input frequency of the repeater at random intervals and thus jamming it for use by distant signals, and repeating the transmission in full power over the wider range of the repeater's span. As mentioned, the more advanced jammers would play music and would transmit at random intervals to make detection much harder. Some would also be designed to mimic a fault on the repeater, ensuring that hours and hours of time were wasted by the repeater keepers trying to clear a fault that was not even there. On this particular site there had been 3 devices left and all had been found by local hams. The people that had left the devices had enabled the jamming signals to be transmitted far too long, and their eventual detection by some very determined local hams was inevitable, as they also saw this as a perfect challenge that was almost made for them and decided to up the fear factor. Perpetrators were quite annoyed that someone had discovered and stolen their equipment, that they decided to up the ante a little and perhaps deter other people from inspection, and they did this by making the devices, well, let's just say mildly combustible. So a much more advanced device was made, and this device was booby-trapped with a flare. This flare would light and spook inquisitive minds, although looking back now of course this would have been intended as a prank, but at the time it was treated this way, and as you will find out, fairly seriously. The device was positioned quite close to the repeater on a small island in the middle of Worrell Lake at Wootton Underwood, some 2 miles away but completely line of sight with the repeater's mast. This device was quite effective for a number of weeks before its location was pinpointed by the local group of hams, who helped direct the local estate manager, Mike Harrison, to the device. When he overturned it, it was clear that the device was booby-trapped, and he called in the police, who in turn called in the bomb squad to defuse it. The incident made local and national news in the papers and on TV, even making it into the digital news as it was back then via CFAX, a low graphic messaging system on UK terrestrial TV. What started as an annoying prank was turned into what nowadays would be described as a terror incident, and many at the time thought that this had been taken way out of all proportion, but the press, never one to shy away from stories like this, ran with it, and it really elevated it into something that it really wasn't. To my knowledge, nobody was ever interviewed or questioned or charged with any offence relating to this, nor would they now admit to it. I don't remember any other incidents like this, although there have been many repeater sites raided and equipment stolen, antennas broken or pulled down, etc. Nowadays it is very rare that you hear anybody on VHF or UHF repeaters. Most of the traffic, if any, is all digital these days, and with the exception of a handful of repeaters, misuse is now generally a thing of the past. I hope you have enjoyed this little insight into the strange goings on of our little hobby, and whilst the bedevilment and the annoyance to the repeater operators has to be frowned upon, you can't help but have a slight twist of a smile towards the ingenuity and the tenacity of the people that made and operated the devices, as they were cunning and technically inventive for the time. This would be very cheap and easy to pull off these days, should anyone want to be so annoying. If you've made it to the end of the video, thanks ever so much for watching. If you'd like to watch the original local news feed for this article now, please do. It's a great watch and a great time capsule. And if you do know who planted these things, please get in touch with me. I'd absolutely love to know. Cheers now.
Amateur radio enthusiasts say saboteurs who've been jamming the airways must be stopped before someone is killed. It follows the discovery of a jamming device which had been booby-trapped with explosives.
Hidden by a tree on an island in the middle of nowhere, a crude radio device, booby-trapped with explosives. The man who discovered it was cautious about his find. Luckily for him, it failed to go off.
I unearthed topsoil and found a white box, and he said be a bit careful, so I got a long stick and I just poked the whole lot out and had a look in the bottom of the hole, and in the bottom of the hole I said, well, I think it's a sort of a booby trap thing. It's a sort of a peg with a little battery on it and that little flare thing on the bottom.
You probably appreciate that Victor Alpha did have a jamming device set up near to it recently, and someone fitted a booby trap to it.
In recent weeks, radio amateurs who've been sending messages to far-flung friends have been suffering unexpected interference and interruptions. The device, which had been placed close to a relay mast at Brill, had been jamming their transmissions. But now it's become more than an irritation. It's a sinister and calculated development. The booby trap was clearly supposed to harm anyone trying to move the device.
Someone could have been blinded or maimed or indeed killed with that device the other day. But from the other aspect, of course they should be stopped. We're not doing any harm. We're using our radio for our hobby, and these people, for whatever reason, sheer devilment, vandalism, they need to be stopped.
It's believed there's at least one other device planted by an anti-radio ham group in the area. The public are warned not to tamper with anything that looks suspicious and to contact the police immediately.